friends and comrades. It's great to see so many people here for this meeting, and congratulations to Chris and Raj for organising this. I think it's incredible. I still have to pinch myself that nearly 51 years ago now, Martin Luther King came to Newcastle University and gave this astonishing speech. A speech not just against racism, but a speech against what he called the triple evils of capitalism. Against racism, against war, and against poverty. And it was a speech that he had made a few months earlier in New York at the Riverside Church, in the context of a massive upheaval inside America, which placed Martin Luther King very much in an isolated position, because he had realised that the fight against civil rights, which had been successful on one level, didn't go far enough. It didn't address the poverty in the ghettos. It didn't address class unity. And it didn't address the war that the American government was waging in Vietnam. And he was beginning to join the dots, to go beyond the single issue campaign, to say this was a structural problem. This is a problem that required a structural solution. And he talked about things like social transformation, a revolution in values. And suddenly Martin Luther King found himself quite isolated from sections of the Black liberation movement who wanted to restrict the campaign to race. And certainly he found himself at the wrong end of the state, because what he was calling for ultimately was for the state to be overthrown. So this was an amazing speech, and it was amazing that he came to Newcastle to give that speech. See, in the 13 years or so of Martin Luther King's period of activism in the civil rights movement, he didn't go abroad very often. But when he did go abroad, and it signifies his internationalist credentials, he went abroad in 1957 to Ghana for the independence of Ghana against the British. He went to India in 59 on what he called a pilgrimage to India to learn the lessons of passive or active non-violence, which brought down the British Empire, which led to the empire coming down. He went to Oslo in 1964 to receive the Nobel Peace Prize, and he came to Newcastle in 1967. He didn't even know where Newcastle was. He just got out of prison, and his secretary called up Newcastle when they arrived at London Heathrow Station Airport and asked if it's possible to get a taxi to Newcastle, because it's only like that far on the map. So why did he come? It's really interesting about the reason why he came. And I think it has everything to do with the fact that at that time, he was looking for allies, he was looking for an analysis, and he was looking for a way forward for the even bigger struggle that had to be waged if racism was going to be permanently defeated, and that was a struggle against the system as a whole. Now, we may have differences with Martin Luther King over his theology, but talk about learning the lessons of the past and the importance of activism, two things that Martin Luther King stood for. And that was, whatever differences you have, whether you believe in God or don't believe in God, whether you believe in that God or this God, it doesn't matter. The most important thing, we'll have that debate, but we'll have that debate while we're marching together against the racists on the streets. And the second lesson was really this, was that the system as a whole will not give up power. It will not give up power, and it's up to us as ordinary people to come together, to unite, whatever our differences, and to take to the streets. And that lesson, and that argument, which he waged relentlessly throughout his whole life, is one, obviously, that we need to take stock of today, and that's the importance of Martin Luther King today. And that was the framing device for us in making this film. My creative collaborator, Geeta, is in the room. We discussed this, about how we would make Martin Luther King not simply a historical figure. So the film itself is divided into three parts, and I need just to briefly explain this, otherwise it won't make sense to you. The first part is really about a celebration of activism now. So that you will see footage of protest, the great demonstration against Trump just after he was elected in London I think it was March 2017, and I can already see some faces in the room of people who were on that demonstration. That, alongside footage of demonstrations waged by low-paid workers against corporate exploitation and corporate greed in New York on May Day in 2017. That's the first part. The second part is archive footage, and it takes us back to Newcastle in the late 60s. It takes us back to Enoch Powell's Rivers of Blood speech, when workers across the country, many workers, came out in support of Enoch Powell's racist speech, including 500 workers from the Dunlop factory in Gateshead. So we show some of that footage. And then we cut to footage of Powell actually in Newcastle. He came to Newcastle in January 1969 to visit the Rutherford College, which is now part of Northumbria University. And he gave a speech, and it was subject to a massive protest by students. Some wanting his right to speak, others saying he didn't have the right to speak. So we show that. The third and final part, we show Martin Luther King's speech in full, or at least of the footage that we have. It was a speech that he gave, went on for about 35 minutes. We only have 7 minutes of it, which is still in existence. So we show the whole speech set against the place where he gave the speech, moving on to the place where Martin Luther King was shot and killed, just 4 months after he gave the speech, 4 and a bit months. And then we show the speech set against the continuing struggle against racism, war and poverty today. So that's the structure of the film. The film was originally commissioned by the Great North Museum, Hancock, as part of Freedom City 27. And in its original form, it was 3 large cinematic screens. And so this is obviously a much scaled down version, and I don't know how you at the back are going to quite see all of it. So it's a miniaturized version of how the film should be seen. But I'm glad I was asked to show it to you today, because I think it still is relevant. It's 20 minutes long, and it's very loud. It's meant to try and evoke what it actually feels like to be in those demonstrations. So if you're at the back, you might have difficulty in seeing it, but you'll certainly hear it. If you're at the front, you might be able to see it, but you might need earplugs in order to survive. Okay, well, thank you very much. Enjoy the film.